and gentlemen, welcome to PAX. Please take your seats and silence all cell phones. Our program begins now.
Hi everybody, how's everyone doing tonight? Good to hear. So I have a few questions for you guys. Have you ever, found yourself at home playing, Metroids, something like that, being like, gee, I really wish I could have a giant floating energy-sucking brain monster as a pet? Or like you're playing Bioshock and you're like, oh my gosh, I wish I could shoot like electricity and bees out of my hands. Well, I've got good news for you, because that's what this whole panel is about. For Metroids to, Plasmids, genetic engineering in video games. So, I can let, Andy do the talking first.
Okay. Hi, I am Andy, also sometimes known as Carl Sagan 42. And thank you. Hi. And so I have a degree actually in this, amazingly. So we study genetic engineering in plants. We make vaccines in plants and do all sorts of fun stuff like that. So we'll be telling you about some cool stuff with genetic engineering.
So I'm Joe, and I also have a shameless plug for Twitch up there that you can ignore. I am a PhD student and normally a sleepy scientist, and right now I'm working on making spider silk implants because I'm the mad scientist up on this panel.
There we go. And I am Brendan. I'm a master's student, also at ASU. I am their student. I also grow vaccines and plants. I work on making universal flu vaccines, and I ironically hate salads. I think they're offensive.
Hey, we don't all share that. All right, guys, so I'm going to be getting us started here. This is good in terms of hearing me, right? Yeah. All right, sweet. All right, so I'm going to be telling you guys, well, I'm not going to look that direction. Whoops, my bad. I'm going to be telling you guys about viruses in video games, and how some of the cool things that happen in video games can be done with viruses. So viruses are extremely tiny, like really freaking tiny. So if you imagine the relationship between like a human and the entire planet, that's about the size difference between a virus and a human. So we're basically like an entire world to a virus. Very, very, very small. So because of that, they can't really do very much stuff by themselves. But what viruses do then, because they can't do anything by themselves, is they kind of have to take something over and get it to do something for them. So viruses invade and genetically reprogram their host cells to do usually nefarious things, though not always. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. So they'll reprogram a cell to make more viruses, and then that makes more viruses to go off and infect more cells and make more viruses, and the cycle continues. So just imagine something really annoying that won't go away, and then imagine that thing multiplying over and over and over again. And that's basically your virus. All right, so in video games, one of the classic examples of viruses is like the Tyrant virus or T-virus from Resident Evil, which turns people into these shambling, grotesque monsters with maybe a little bit of a taste for human flesh. So something that I was thinking about when I was getting into this is, well, can a virus really cause something like this? Like, is this even remotely plausible at all? Like, we're going to get into that a little bit. In general, I think viruses are kind of perfect for this kind of thing in games, because like the thought of something really, really small taking you over and like changing your behavior and making you do all this stuff is just super creepy. So it fits really well for horror games in particular. But could you really do something like this? Well, what would you need to make a virus like this that could genetically modify somebody to do all these nefarious things? So to alter somebody's behavior, a virus would have to have access to the central nervous system or to the brain. Well, as it turns out, this is actually really easy for viruses to do. They do it all the time, and you're all pretty much infected with them right now. So we have our body's pretty much covered with nerves, so we have these like little nerves going all the way through us, which let us do wonderful things like feel and push controller buttons. And in order for you to do that, to operate these nerves, you have signals that go back and forth between your nerves and your brain. In other words, you have big, giant virus highways straight to your brain in the form of all these nerves. Because if a virus infects your skin, it can sort of ride one of these nerves to your brain and have access to your brain. And this is done with things like herpes, with polio, with rabies, with measles. There's a lot of viruses that already know how to do this kind of stuff. It turns out about like 65% of people already have herpes virus sort of hanging out in their nerves right now. You all probably have it. And it just, rears its ugly head every once in a while when you get like a cold sore in your mouth. And over 90% have another one called human cytomegalovirus. So I wish I could have shown you this as a little video, but like this is like a neuron, and all the green things in it are scientists have like made the virus that's in it glow green, and you can kind of watch it move. I can't show you the actual video, unfortunately, but if you just imagine these little things just zipping back and forth, viruses know how to get around inside of your nerves. Okay, that's great. So the viruses can infect you, and they can get into your brain, but how can they actually alter your behavior? So we have different regions in our brain that sort of process things, like whenever we, whenever we like come across something, like if you're standing up on stage giving a speech and your brain is like, oh my gosh, you should be afraid right now. We have all these processes that go on in your brain, decide whether we should be aggressive or empathetic. And so, for example, rabies virus can essentially affect these neurons and interfere with the signal that your brain is trying to send. So your brain might be like, OMG, you should be afraid right now, but then rabies virus blocks that. So then it's like, oh, well, now I'm not actually afraid anymore. I don't feel fear. So like you might literally be like, this is fine when something is burning down in front of you. So this is sort of similar to what alcohol does. You guys might be more familiar with that, like when you can do something kind of without considering the consequences. And so viruses have kind of tapped into those naturally occurring pathways in your brain to do that sort of stuff. So that's like inhibiting something. Well, they can also stimulate things as well, something that wouldn't normally be active in your brain. So for example, rabies can make people really aggressive or animals really aggressive, which makes rabid animals bite more frequently. And of course, it does this because it like sits in your saliva, it's almost like a zombie virus to some extent. And when it bites something, then it transfers the virus to its new host, and it kind of spreads around that way. So viruses certainly can affect your brain. Okay, so that's one thing that viruses do in games. I just want to point out here that like when I was thinking about this and kind of researching this stuff, it really struck me like, at first I was like, oh, this is just going to be all implausible. Like maybe there's something in this that could ever be real. I was like amazed at just everything I was coming across. It was like, this is like, it actually scares me. Like if you had a lack of ethics strong enough, you could probably make something like this. All right, so that's like how you could alter somebody's behavior with a virus. But how about giving somebody new abilities? Like in games, you'll see like, creating super soldiers or like getting different special powers and those kinds of things. And could a virus really do something like that? So if you take the example in Fallout, they have these like big green vats where they dip people into this, bubbling green goo, and it creates these wonderful looking super mutants, which are pretty majestic, depending. So it turns out that this goo that they get dipped in is actually delicious virus-ridden goo, which I didn't even realize about the game when I first played it. But yeah, it's called forced evolutionary virus. And the idea is that the virus goes in and it changes the person's genes to give them these new powers. All right, so we need a reality check here. Can viruses really be engineered to change the DNA, the genes, of the thing that they're infecting? Heck yeah. Yeah, they can. This is literally the entire premise of a very real field known as viral gene therapy. So researchers have discovered all sorts of different viruses, like, I was talking about like measles and polio and all these bad things. Well, there are all sorts of viruses out there that really don't hurt anybody. They don't cause disease, but they still do the same things that viruses do to go in and infect somebody and change their DNA. Basically, you take whatever genes that you want, and you find one of these harmless viruses, and you put those genes into it, and it'll sort of act as a way to spread throughout your body, reprogramming it to do whatever you do, basically exactly what forced evolutionary virus does in Fallout. You can do questionable things with this, like, you could make like a super soldier that's super buff, like you could increase somebody's aggression or reduce fear the ways that we talked about, or of course, just plain kill people. One of the examples that I ran into has to do with this thing called myostatin. So without getting too much into the details, basically it's like a way that your body has to control muscle growth. And it turns out there's like a type of cow that naturally has a genetic mutation in this gene that makes super buff cows. So you get these like this is real. This is like, nobody made this. It just naturally exists. And it has this genetic mutation. It's crazy. Well, researchers using that same thing infected mice, rabbits, dogs with a virus that gives this mutation. And so you feel like the one on the right is the one that is the mutant. It's like this huge, giant, buff mouse compared to the one on the left. So they did this with dogs too. So here's a normal doggo. It's very cute. And this is with one copy of that gene. You can see it gets super ripped. And then like this is with 2 copies, it's just like gets crazy. And like if you give it 3 copies of the, no, I'm just kidding. You can't. you only have 2 copies of every gene. You can't have 3 copies. But like, you get the idea. So like that's just one gene. There's like hundreds of genes that one could find and imagine to do stuff like this. So like, could you create super mutants and super soldiers? Yeah, with enough lack of ethics, heck yeah, you could. But like people are actually concerned about this thing called gene doping, where like athletes who want to get an edge might like decide to just inject themselves with viruses that give them these mutations to get these new abilities. So that's probably something that people will have to debate and think about in the future, just in terms of that. However, I want to take a quick break here because, like, okay, we're talking about making zombies, we're talking about making super soldiers and all of this stuff. It's like, why does everybody always want to take stuff and just do all of the worst things with it? Like, we don't have to do these super questionable, ridiculous things. So, like, all right, viruses get a bad rap. Viruses in games, especially, like, I don't know, how many of you are, like, when you think of viruses, if you just think of, in general, like, if just whatever comes to your mind when you think of viruses, how many of you think of bad things? Like, probably basically all of you, right? You think about getting sick, you think about throwing up, like all of these horrible things that viruses do, right? So, no, viruses are like 99.99% at least like neutral, and a lot of them actually beneficial. So like even healthy people who don't have any disease have like 1 to 20 million viruses per inch inside and outside of your body. Like you are covered with viruses from head to toe. And that's a healthy person. They're not doing anything bad. It turns out like 8% of our actual DNA, like all of our DNA, is viruses. It's virus DNA that got there from viruses. And so these things are called endogenous retroviruses, but basically we've been genetically modifying ourselves with these viruses for millions of years. So I'm going to give you guys one crazy example to try to think about. This thing is just like blew my mind the first time I read about it. So like all viruses, shown in this little picture here, have kind of like a protective shell around them. So they're kind of like, it's like this little package that protects the genes on the inside. It's the genes on the inside of the virus that really make you sick. But so that little package on the outside, keep that in mind. So there is a gene in our neurons, which we use to communicate with each other in our brain and stuff, that is kind of like a little package that like wraps up a message that your neurons send to each other. It's called ARC. And it turns out that package that your body uses looks exactly like a virus. So like people, when we looked at this, were like, well, where did this thing come from? Well, it turns out researchers now think that is literally used to be a virus. And so like we all have in us, components of viruses. And it's just like, it's not like that was a one-off thing. We're finding this stuff everywhere. So like there's another type of virus that like makes cells stick together really well. And it turns out like the lining, this is kind of weird. It's like, why am I talking about a placenta right now? Okay, stick with me. All right, stick with me. The lining of the placenta actually has these cells that are stuck together that helps the infant exchange nutrients with the mother. And so these cells need to stick together to do that. It's like, it looks again exactly like what the virus is doing. And when people looked at it, they realized that the gene is basically just a gene from a virus. So viruses gave us some components of neurons and also placentas and other things too, probably. All right, so like we could make zombies and all of these horrible things in video games, or we could like cure super horrible genetic diseases. So like there's this eye condition, I don't know how to exactly say the name, like Leber's congenital amaurosis. It's really terrible. So basically the people who have this, they slowly go blind. And it's like there's absolutely nothing that we've been able to do about this. Like they get this disease and eventually their eyesight gets worse and they can go blind until last year. So researchers took the missing genes, put them inside of a virus, one of those harmless viruses, and they deliver it to the person's eye, and the virus like spreads throughout the tissue in the eye and gives them back the gene that they were missing. So it repairs the problem in their eye. This is the very first treatment using a virus to deliver genes that was ever approved for use in humans, and it restored vision without any negative side effects. So it's extremely, extremely promising. So just to give you guys one more example here before I finish nerding out about cool things viruses can do, is there's this other type of virus called a bacteriophage, and it's a type of, how many of you have heard of bacteriophages before? I'm wondering, oh, okay, you guys know your science. Heck yeah. Bacteriophages basically kill bacteria. They're viruses, but they kill bacteria. So there was a really interesting example from last year where there was a patient who was, and I'm sure many of you have heard about like how antibiotic resistant bacteria are a big problem. And so there's a potential to use these bacteriophages to kill those bacteria when they're infecting somebody. So there's a patient who was in a coma, like their body was just flooded with these bacteria that every other treatment had failed. And so researchers gave them these bacteriophages. They identified a whole bunch of different bacteriophages that could kill these bacteria. And just, they flooded the patient with trillions of these things. And the viruses are essentially harmless to the people that are being given to them. They can't hurt you. They only hurt bacteria. And the patient recovered and is back to normal. So this is a really cool picture. This is like a real electron microscope picture of a bunch of these bacteriophages like blowing up this cell. This is like what it would look like if you could zoom in 400,000 times to what's going on in the cell. So anyway, there are like thousands of people all over the world studying viruses, not trying to create super mutants, not trying to create zombies, though maybe those are out there too. I hope not. I don't know. So we can do all sorts of really cool things. So I hope after this, that if I've done nothing else in this presentation, to hopefully convince you that viruses can do lots of really cool things and a lot of potential. And the next time you see a nasty one in a video game, you might reconsider that they can do some cool stuff too. So thank you.
How many people in here have played Mass Effect? Yeah. All right, my people. So I'm going to be talking about, firstly, how we can use genetic engineering to both fight our worst enemies and save our best friends, the Krogan in each case, really. So you guys know what the genophage is, but real quick, I'm going to go over it. It's a biological weapon. Got to keep that in mind. It was designed to reduce the Krogan population, so we didn't want to kill out all the Krogan. We just wanted to, reduce their numbers because they breed like rabbits and they're horrible and warlike. And then also we infected them with this genophage, and that comes in just a second. But how could we have done this? Now, how many of you have heard of CRISPR-Cas9 just on the news? Good or bad? Good? Good? Oh, wow. It seems like things have changed a little bit in the public perception. So I think it's great, and we can use it to get rid of Krogan, which is even better. So, as you guys probably have heard, CRISPR-Cas9 is essentially molecular scissors that you can use and then go in and snip out a gene and replace it with whatever you want. So we can take any gene for virility out of the Krogan and put in something that sort of messes with them, so we can like clip the tails off their sperm or do whatever we want to them. So we can just keep doing that to every virility gene that the Krogan have over and over and over again. But we can do that, and we can do that with, say, a dozen different CRISPR-Cas9 systems. But how do we deliver that? So as Andy already talked about, viruses really like to get into our cells, and we could package that CRISPR-Cas9, that molecular scissor, into a virus, and then that could deliver itself to Krogan. It could be only for the Krogan. So as a human, as a Turian, I don't have to worry about that at all. We can even do something easier, which is we can use these micelles, which is just a lipid sheath around our molecular scissor, and we can give that to the Krogan. So very simple, very quick, very easy. But we can't get all the Krogan at once. So even if we release this into the atmosphere on their home planet, we're not going to get all of them. It's not possible. Luckily, there's something that we've already come up with called gene drives. Now, this picture is a little complex, but don't worry. I'm going to walk you through it real quick. So all CRISPR-Cas9 does is it snips out a gene and then lets you put a gene in. All a gene drive does is let you snip out a gene and then put in a gene coding for another molecular scissor to snip out other genes. So you're just using scissors to put in scissors that'll then cut another gene. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of complicated. I'm trying to break it down as much as possible. But the reason it's so awesome is because when anything breeds, so when you have two Krogan, one that's infected, one that's not, they breed, then that kid is going to have all those genes snipped out. And every time they breed, they're also going to have offspring with all those genes snipped out. So, mission accomplished. That was super easy. We just reduced the population of the Krogan, but how do we reverse that? I mean, obviously, we all, playing through the game, reversed it and didn't shoot Morden, right? Because that'd be really sad. Okay, I'm glad. So, it's also simple to reverse it. So we can just use a gene drive to replace all those genes that we already cut out with the original genes. So super easy fix. The game portrayed this as a really, really hard problem, and the reason that would be hard is because we have to do it with all those genes, and there's mutations that happen and a bunch of different stuff. But it's possible. So we know how to get rid of the Krogan, but what about real life? The Krogan are our worst enemies. I mean, we could be friends even if they were at full strength and not reduced in population. So our worst enemy, at least to me, is malaria. So there are 216 million cases worldwide every year, or around that every year, and of those, about 450,000 people die from this parasite. Now, if you don't know, malaria is a parasite that is transported by mosquitoes, a very specific type. So it sucks up someone's blood that has the parasite, gives it to you, and then it just keeps going and going and going. Well, gene drives, if you might notice, the mosquitoes on here were originally designed to get rid of the malaria problem. So you can give mosquitoes genes that make them resistant to malaria and therefore can't carry it. And you can use gene drives the same way that we would with the Krogan to get rid of malaria from the mosquito population and save thousands of lives every year, hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, that was pretty brief. I wanted to talk about Mass Effect because it's one of my favorite games, but who's played BioShock? All right, I told you I was the mad scientist of this group, right? So, talked about genetic engineering, but how do I get plasmids? I want to shoot lightning out of my hands, right? That's awesome. So, we got a couple tools in our tool shed. We got actual plasmids, because those are a real thing. We have CRISPR-Cas9, which I just told you guys a little bit about. And there's also symbiotic organisms, which I think are really cool. So how would it actually work in real life? Well, first I'll tell you what a plasmid is. So over on your guys' left is just a quick diagram of a plasmid, and it is as simple as it looks. It's just a circular gene or number of genes that you can take and you can give directly to people. So you can take a DNA vaccine, which is just plasmid, inject it into someone, and they can become resistant to one of the bad viruses Andy talked about. You can do the same thing with CRISPR-Cas9. You can add genes to someone that way. But we have one problem. We don't have a gene for shooting electricity. And I mean, off the top of my head, what does, right? I mean, a hippo can't, but Geobacter can. So there's this little bacteria, super cool. It makes these biofilms that it can use to essentially create little electric shocks from consuming metals. So, all right, we got a gene, but it's going to be a lot of genes, actually, to make those biofilms. And instead of looking like it would in BioShock, it would look more like you just got really, really slimy, nasty hands and skin. So maybe there's a better option than that. So enter symbiotic organ. No, don't.
Shocking.
I might have given him a dose. But anyway, I think a better option would be these symbiotic organisms. You guys probably know about a couple. So we have cleaner shrimp and fish, and divers. You might have seen that video floating around on Facebook. You have these little shrimp come and clean your teeth. Kind of gross. Works really well, though. You have African oxpeckers cleaning the backs of a bunch of different big African wildlife. And then also, of course, mitochondria and your own cells. So we already have these symbiotic organisms inside us, so it wouldn't be that big of a jump to put Geobacter into our cells in our skin and get our nice lightning hands. So pros, we have lightning skin. It would probably be all of your skin. Cons, really slimy. You can't touch anything electronic because it'll zap it and kill it. And also, probably the worst thing, no more hugs. So even your mom's not going to want to give you a hug after you do this. So lightning, possible. Maybe not. But what about bees? I want bee hands. All right? Be really cool. So bees might be a little hard. Having a whole hive inside your body, that seems really creepy. No one really want that. And realistically, why would you do bees? Because the world is way weirder than having bees in your hands. So this is a picture of the Portuguese man-of-war, which is a crazy, crazy organism. So it essentially looks like a jellyfish, not closely related to jellyfish, and is made up of a bunch of different species of polyps living in a single colony that creates its own organism. So you have its stingers, its float, which is that sort of crest up at the top. You have its sex organs, digestive organs, and also its sensory organs are all different species, all coming together just like your eyes, your heart, your lungs, etc. And it's essentially a love letter to Lovecraft, because look at that thing, pretty creepy. But I think we could take those polyps that make up the stingers, put them into our hands, and get these nice little stinger shooting hands, which is kind of close to bees. It has some range to it. You can keep it in your hands so you can still text and whatnot. So I think that's a good option. I would like stinger hands. I'd like these Portuguese man-of-war hands. And it paves the way for having some hideous beasts of humans and or synthetic organisms, which Brandon will be talking to you about shortly.
mean, I just want to point out that like we could just stick our hands in like beehives, and we'd have bee hands essentially the same way. Let me know how that works.
No.
All right, so yeah, as you mentioned before, I'm Brandon. I'm going to talk to you guys about some synthetic organisms in video games, but as I said before, I'm their student. I've been having to take lots of quizzes. I actually had a class on Friday before I got to come to PAX, and so I'm going to give you guys a quiz. Pop quiz. Who wants Metroid as a pet? Raise your hand. Yay? Yes? No? All of the above? Maybe? All right, so for those who answered A and C somehow, congrats! You have a baby Metroid. This is your baby Metroid. I don't know who you bought it from. Don't ask. Maybe it was like some weird space dragon. But you have a baby Metroid. So this is a Metroid. For those of you who don't know, it's adorable. It's like a puppy. Wouldn't you want a puppy? I mean, it's great, but everyone knows that puppies do get bigger, right? And so do Metroids, right? And they get bigger. And they get bigger. And then they're like not even recognizable from that adorable puppy that you had. I mean, you have like, on one side you have like this couch or this like rug, right? That used to be this adorable little like fluff ball. And on the other end you have a weird like spider thing, right? This doesn't look like this, right? This is completely different. But unlike puppies that kind of just stop at like that rug level, Metroids keep growing and growing and growing, all right? It's kind of horrifying, actually. And they eventually reach something like this. They become even more scary and terrifying and big, right? And for the puppy, the sake of the puppy comparison, it is essentially like if you were to buy a puppy and it grew into Cerberus, okay? Like you cannot reasonably expect your puppy to grow into Cerberus. Why would you expect your Metroid to grow into, this Queen Metroid, right? Well, because that's what Metroids do, right? That's what organisms do. So for those of you who did have the pop quiz, the correct answer is no. You would not want a Metroid as a pet, okay? But I'm not here to like stifle your intellectual freedom. This is America. You can buy Metroids from Space Dragons if you want to. But you're probably asking like, my baby, who did this? Who turned my baby into this horrifying Queen Metroid monster, right? Well, I think I have this observation I'd like to make with you guys. You guys might have made this before, but genetic engineers in video games are creepy, all right? Why would you ever buy anything from any of these guys, right? The dude on the left, the Chozo bird, that made the Metroid, okay? Their creations don't usually work out as planned either in video games. But yeah, I mean, like, I wouldn't want to buy a Metroid. Not from that dude, right? But, let's just say, after all I've said, just like, we failed the pop quiz, you still want the Metroid, you're really angry about it, you're willing to buy it from that dude, let's make one, okay? Why not, right? We want a Metroid, we may as well make it. Like, how do we make a Metroid? Well, it's probably some genetic stuff, and I'll use some Pokemon as an example, because everyone knows Pokemon, right? Right? Yeah, right. So, like, let's say I want to make a Mewtwo, like in this Pokemon 2000, the Pokemon the first movie, all right? I'm like the scientist, I'm Mr. Fuji, I want to make a Mewtwo, right? Is it even possible? I don't know, but let's keep going. So, like, we know that Mewtwo was made from Mew, right? There's this, they wanted to clone, like, Mew, and they, like, got this DNA from Mew, and they, like, kind of did some Jurassic Park stuff to it, and, like, they ended up with this big, purple, powerful, like, perfect organism, right? Perfect organism. We could totally try to, like, find a Mew, right? Or we could try to find a Mewtwo, right? But last time I checked, I did check under a truck for quite a while, there is only one of each, right? So the chances of me actually getting like Mew or Mewtwo's DNA, assuming they don't have the internet in Pokemon, and they haven't sequenced it yet, is pretty low, right? So then what do? I still want my Mewtwo. I don't just give up, right? Well, we could try building one from scratch, right? Because why not? So let's do a quick science lesson, right? So to build an organism, we can take different organisms and combine them, right? Like what makes a Mewtwo? Raise your hand. Who can tell me like what Pokemon like combine into a Mewtwo? Anyone? Any Pokemon? Ditto? Good guess. I was thinking something like an Abra. I don't know, because it's got like ears. Most Pokemon don't. It has a tail. Meowth. It can, it's a cat. Why not? I have those lying around. They're easy to get. And like it's like a Muck. Why not? Let's come on like an Abra, a Muck, and a Meowth, right? And well, if you try to combine anything like this, if you just put organisms into like a blender, you do end up with like a Ditto, right? It doesn't. It doesn't end up very well, right? You shouldn't blend animals. Don't do that. So like that's a problem, right? We can't just combine organisms, right? That's silly. But we can identify certain things in each organism that does make a Mewtwo, right? Like we know that Abra has a tail, Meowth can speak English, and I guess Muck is purple. So, we can just combine those traits. Well, how do we do that genetically? Well, suffice it to say, biologists have kind of invented this thing in a collaboration with engineers called biobricks. And essentially, when a scientist like finds a gene that they like one that encodes a certain protein that has some kind of feature, they put it in like this biobrick kind of thing. They're easily combinable. They're like Legos for scientists. They're really tiny, and you can combine them. So if you say have you like the purple gene for muck and the speaking gene for Meowth, because there's totally just one gene for that, right? You combine them and you get like biobrick number 3. You get like the purple speaking gene, right? And you can eventually like string these all along, right? You can get like psychic type, tail, the speaking ability, and purple, and you can combine all these things and you can get something close to a Mewtwo, right? You can get, it's basically a Mewtwo, right? It might not speak very well. It is an off shade of purple, but we got a Mewtwo, right? We've built our Mewtwo from scratch, right? And so those same principles can be applied to evil, right? In video games, they often are. You got Deathclaws, these Jackson chameleons plus other species, most Zerg from StarCraft. Basically, like literally every bioweapon ever in video games, like most of the viruses that Andy was talking about, you generally want to combine genes, right? But thankfully, it's a little bit more complicated than that to make bigger organisms like Metroids and Mewtwo, right? I would hope so. So, like, just breaking it down, it would require, 6 biobricks just to get, the floating, the energy leaching, the brain-like structure, the greenness, they're mostly green, like fangs and screeching ability, right? That's 6 whole biobricks. That's a lot of experiments, right? But last I checked, Metroids aren't just these weird floating shells. They're alive, right, mostly. And so they need a metabolism. They need structure. They need replication. They need to be able to replicate it with each other. I don't want to think about that. You got basic sets of proteins. You've got communication. They have to be able to screech at each other. And they have to have like these basic like little organelles, like the mitochondria in their cells, right? There's a lot of different biobricks. It's not just 6 and it's not just 12. It's actually really complicated, right? So I took this little chart from like a website. This is glycolysis. All of it is like breaking down sugars in the most simple way. And this is an E. coli, okay? This is like super inefficient. We do this, but we prefer to do something else called oxidative phosphorylation. This is in mitochondria. All the boxes are genes, by the way. These are all individual biobricks we'd have to make, okay? And, this is your typical human eukaryotic cell. Every dot is a gene, okay? So as you can see, it's not that, like, simple, right? To build organisms and build viruses, even viruses, like, it's complicated, right? So as much as it could be applied to evil, we could make all these crazy things in video games. For now, it's not quite as plausible. But like Andy said, in 100 years, maybe, we have some really crazy scientists that don't have very good ethics. I mean, yeah, this could happen, right? But like, what can we do? Why did I come here and like tell you all this like to make you depressed? Like, we can't make these things in video games. Your dreams will never come true unless you like become a terrible person. Well, they're basically like Legos for geneticists, right? And instead of having to make like these big complicated gene circuits, we can just simplify things, right? So we can resurrect current extinct species. If we can find those genes that make up like a mammoth, for example, like hairy and is an elephant, we can maybe combine those. We can put like a biobrick that has like the hair gene and like big old tusks and like 3 times the size of like a house into an elephant, and we'll get a mammoth, right? We can solve problems like climate change. We can, put in genes for enzymes that, take up carbon dioxide and methane from the atmosphere and put those into bacteria and then just like spray them all over airplanes and like make them fly all over the place and eat all the carbon dioxide. We can terraform planets with the same principle. Just send some bacteria in a rocket to Mars, wait like 1,000 years, and then good. You can go live there, right? You can grow meat in petri dishes. You can turn sewage into energy. You can make essential pharmaceuticals and plants, hint, hint, that we do. Like insulin, things like that, vaccines. But this is a video game convention. We're not here to talk about like all the cool things that scientists are doing all together, right? I still want a pet Metroid, right? I came to this panel. You told me I still want a pet Metroid. I want to shoot lightning out of my hands. How do I do it, right? I'm not a scientist. Well, lucky for you, you guys probably know the basic principles of, reproduction, right? When a mommy and a daddy love each other very much, I see some kids in the audience. I'm not going to go too much further than that, but, you can, there's the principle of, like, reproduction, right? And if you know that you have, like, a really purple muck and a really purple muck, and you want more purple mucks, you breed the 2 purple mucks, right? If you want, like, a less purple muck, you combine them, right? That's how you do it. As a common people, and, even scientists, too, we often do this because it's a lot easier to just, up and down regulate the expression of genes by a selective breeding than it is to actually like go from scratch, right? So like let's say that we find some kind of creepy like coral in Japan, I don't know, that makes sense to me, and we know that it looks like a brain, right? And we can combine it with another coral that looks like it has like fang-like coral, right? If we can splice them together or breed them together somehow, we can get like a Metroid-like looking coral, and then we just keep on going and eventually we get something like a Metroid, right? we can also downregulate things we don't want. So like, let's say this brain coral, like, I don't know, whispers dark secrets to you, like an old god or something. We can try to breed that out, right? We don't want to breed that. So you can downregulate those things too. This is really useful. I mean, seriously, we've been doing it for like years and generations, literally, generations and generations, right? Like Yoshis, right? We could breed Yoshis with scarier Yoshis and eventually get like a weird mustachioed dinosaur. Don't sue me, Nintendo. You can also do it like more directly. If you know the genes that are in play, you don't actually have to go through selective breeding. You can actually just take the embryo and like add like 2 or 3 copies of the gene, or do other things to the circuits to make sure that those genes are upregulated, right? And so it's really useful. I mean, historically, it's made corn suck less. The thing on the left is what corn used to look like, and on the right, it's what you go to Pike Place, and that's what you get. You can also make dogs less bitey. You can have like this scary wolf. You can get like a cute puppy that might grow into a queen Metroid. That's what we're taking away from this, right? And more recently, they've made bacteria that can eat plastic and crude oil and styrofoam just by selectively like growing these bacteria on like plastic, crude oil, and styrofoam. The ones that live have these genes. They have more copies. They reproduce. We have this bacteria now, right? And we go throw it in the ocean. We have like no oil spills, right? And so if we combine these biobricks and we combine this up and down regulation, like selective breeding, it can be really OP, all right? So like, and that's how we get a pet Metroid that doesn't take into a creature, or become a creature that takes up 5 screens, right? All we have to do is, downregulate the growth genes. Now we have like a lizard, all right? And then we silence the growth stage genes by take, CRISPR-Cas9 them out. And, it'd be nice if it like lived longer than us. Maybe like add some turtle genes that, make it live really long. Add some longevity biobricks, and that's how you do it, right? So ta-da, we have our pet Metroid, right? We take these biobricks, we take this up and down regulation, and done. That's how we make Metroids, and all synthetic organisms. It's the same principle. And so, like, I think I want to end this presentation with something a little bit less, kind of depressing, that, why would we make these horrible organisms that do turn into queen Metroids make really fun games, but also decimate entire populations? Like, why did the Chozo make the Metroids in the first place, right? Like, why are scientists, why are your tax money is going to us to make these things, right? Well, we are kind of doing what the Chozo did, right? They made these Metroids to solve these problems, these X-parasites, right? That are, like, floating everywhere and, just decimate these entire populations, kill entire planets. Real-life genetic engineers also use these same principles to, make these organisms from scratch to solve important problems. For example, we did find these real-life Metroids. They're basically Metroids. They eat bacteria, and they have these 2 phases. They have a hunting down phase and like a vampire gene phase, where it literally like latches onto a bacteria and sucks its life out. It's literally a microscopic Metroid. And as biologists, what we can do is modify this bacteria by adding biobricks that are specific for certain kinds of diseases, like cancer, for example, or Alzheimer's plaques, or I don't know, like sadness, and we can make these bacteria attack these things that we don't want, right? We can also make it so they don't attack us. We can use CRISPR-Cas9 to snip out anything that make them recognize humans, and things like that. So yeah, you can take these home. I'm sure you could probably order them, or maybe just go into some soil and find them, and you can have your own pet Metroid. So congratulations. And I think now we're gonna take some questions, because I think we just dumped like half an hour of science onto you.
Yes. Sorry about that, by the way.
All right, we have a mic over here. If you do have questions, to line up over here, just so we can actually hear your questions. It's a big room. If you don't have questions, we'd be happy to answer.
It's too late, I've done it.
Go for it.
So you said something about throw 2 or 3 copies of some gene, and that just makes me curious if, is it easier or harder to cause the gene?
You're talking about myostatin, the thing that made the super big cows, or something else?
No. When it just went down through the generations from influencing a couple, does the number of copies of genes that organisms have impact the ease with which, or like the rate of spread throughout the species?
Well, if you think about it, in the case where you don't have a gene drive, right, and you only have, let's say, like a diploid organism that only has 2 chromosomes for each, like pairs, it will be more likely that its offspring will inherit something that has more copies, because there's more of a probability that 1 chromosome will end up with that copy.
So do scientists do more test stuff with high ploidy organisms?
It's easier to kind of purify the results.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a question in a limerick fashion. I'll explain it afterwards if it's not clear enough. I've read through my notes here twice about scientists whose genes splice. If one went a bit crazy into a rampaging frenzy, how fast could he kill us all twice? And my real question is, how much time and trouble, thank you,
It was beautiful.
would it actually take as mad scientists to start, plans about actually killing us all?
Did he say about killing us?
Yeah, he wants to know how fast we can kill them.
With some viruses, mean viruses.
He wants to know how fast we can kill them twice, actually.
Yeah, twice, please.
Really, really fast if we have no ethics. And I think that's the main lesson to learn from this panel, is that if scientists had zero ethics and zero accountability, then one really angry, upset person could do a lot of bad stuff.
So a lot of the stuff that we work with in the lab will often have a situation where it's like, dang, it only works 99% of the time. And if you imagine applying that to humans, that's horrible. It means, 1 out of 100 people you treat will die. But again, with lack of ethics, that doesn't become a problem at all. Like a lot of these things, like in Fallout, they're dipping, thousands of people into these vats, and like maybe only one comes out a super soldier. So when all you need to do is get 1 out of 1,000 to work, it makes things a lot easier.
And that was kind of what I was mentioning with like the microbial Metroids, right? Like I'd mentioned that like we could, the plastic-eating Metroids, microbes. Sorry. If we were to grow them on like oil, right? It's not like they live very long, right? I mean, I haven't tried drinking crude oil. I wouldn't recommend that you do, but I figure 1 out of every 100 people that do won't die, right? And so with all of this stuff, a mad scientist could very quickly identify some kind of way to kill everyone twice. That is, to raise them up and then bring them back down.
Thank you.
So the complexities of genetic engineering, doing stuff like regrowing limbs, is not particularly close. But would it be possible, in terms of prosthetics, to use genetic engineering to make prosthetics that interface with the human nervous system much more readily than regrowing actual limbs?
Oh my goodness, yes. So there is a whole field that's all about sort of, the main thing is taking organs from like pigs or organ donors, bleaching them out, and then putting your own stem cells into them so they integrate with you perfectly. And we could potentially get to the point soon where instead of trying to regrow a limb, you're just growing a limb in a scientific setting where everything's nice and clean and it's your limb, and then we're attaching that to you, more or less. So there's this weird video that's like this modular chicken wing looking thing that just like flops around, but they grew those muscles and bones and everything and then just hook it up to essentially a bio battery, and it's able to function. So potentially we could take that and then make your own limbs.
There's also a couple of really interesting research areas in terms of regenerating limbs, because even though we can't do it, other organisms can. So like you probably know the example of lizards regenerating their tail. So by studying the way that other organisms do that, we can do things like, rather than inventing something from scratch, we can take something that already exists and apply it to humans. So people are working on that as well. Actually, the lab right next to us does that.
Yeah, I don't know if you Carl Sagan 42 fans noticed on the Twitter the Venus flytraps. Those are actually there. The fruit flies next door, the researchers are trying to figure out how to get them to regrow wings and then eventually apply those to like burn victims to have their skin like just regrow. It'd be kind of weird.
Yeah.
Earlier in the PowerPoint, you mentioned for gene therapy, you have a bunch of viruses that you inject with the gene you want, and then you put that in humans. How do you inject the genes into the virus in the first place? How do you get enough of them, like trillions and trillions of viruses to infect the whole body?
Well, that's a great question. It's something I always wondered too when I was a student. So like, okay, you use the virus to give the gene to the humans, but how do you make the viruses in the first place with all of these different changes? So I guess there's really a couple different parts to that, but in terms of getting a lot of viruses, that's easy. That's what viruses do naturally, is they make lots of copies of themselves. So essentially you just feed them some bacteria or something, or some type of cells, and they'll just make millions of copies of themselves anyway. But how do you give them the genes that you want? Well, using a lot of the tools that we mentioned, like you could do it with CRISPR. There's all sorts of ways that nature has already invented to essentially cut and paste genes. And so by taking those tools, they're like little molecular machines called enzymes. You can like with just like a little swab from your cheek, you could take any gene out of it that you wanted and cut it and put it into one of these viruses. So it's actually incredibly easy. It's one of the biggest advances of the whole genetic engineering field for like the last 30 years is being able to do this stuff. So like I do it in the lab on a routine basis. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer without any more depth without going into a lot of science jargon.
All right, so you're talking a lot about delivery mechanisms and like bacteria, viruses, we know that, they infect people just really well on their own. But you brought up micelles, and that like reminds me of liposomes too. If that was your delivery tool, how would you spread that amongst a population without like singly injecting everyone?
That is going to be very difficult. So the way they did in Mass Effect is that you just have this huge tower that sprays out the genophage up into the atmosphere, and Tuchanka's atmosphere is very hostile. So micelles wouldn't necessarily survive. I was talking more of a just like general administration system. So you would want something like a virus because that'll break down, those micelles break down really easily.
So there's no way those can be like respiratory or ingested?
Maybe. I mean, you could put like a virus coating around that micelle. That's what viruses essentially are, is they have something called capsids that surround all their internal stuff. So you could make sort of a scaffold like that around your micelle, but usually you have the membrane and then the capsid, so it'd be like a reversing of that to protect it. Viruses would be easier.
Yeah, and of course the beauty of creating something like the gene drive that Joe was talking about is that what the gene drive does is when one of your gene gets modified, anything that you interact with, it's essentially like putting in the tools to go make that same modification to somebody else. So it spreads throughout a population, and it's like you get modified, and then it modifies someone else, and then it modifies someone else. So.
How difficult, long, or expensive would it be to, let's say, change the zombie ant fungus, the Osteocordyceps, to impact humans?
So thankfully, very expensive. Very, very expensive, and it would take a long time. But like we're kind of making this seem like, and I think all of our parts, like that this is just something that we can do, like snap our fingers, get a gene for it, things like that. There are so many factors, the biggest one being the immune system, that if we wanted to change the zombie virus, the zombie fungus, right, to infect humans to make a really fun game in real life, it would be immensely difficult, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just something to consider is like how rarely you get a disease that ever infects, like, let alone your pets or like even plants or something like that. Like when organisms develop a way to infect something else, like a virus to infect us, it's so hard, and it's a reflection of the fact that like you don't just get your cat sick all the time whenever you get something. It's not like it's easy for a virus to just change a little bit and infect something else. So like when people used to freak out about like, is Ebola going to get airborne or whatever, like nature's been running these experiments forever, and if it were easy for something to do that, it would have happened already.
Yeah, I can speak like someone who like works with the flu exactly like that. Like we think that the flu just instantly can like switch between human, avian, and swine, right? Or like dog, right? But for the evolutionary pressure against the flu is so high, there really isn't any evolutionary pressure for the fungus to ever evolve past ants because there are just so many ants, right? And it's generally in island situations and Amazon situations where there's just like so many ants. So if a scientist wanted to do it, they'd have to probably be like an ant biologist and a geneticist and an immunologist and all that together, or have this weird like genetic engineering criminal terrorist ring that also really likes video games to know about that. And so thankfully, I'm thinking that terrorists probably don't really play very many video games. So I think we're pretty good. I think.
So a few questions ago, you were mentioning the ability to just make new limbs in a lab for people to have those limbs replaced. But for some reason, that reminds me of a certain movie called The Island, where they initially started doing just that, and for some reason, the limbs weren't interfacing correctly with the humans because they weren't a part of a human biosystem originally. It's like no blood flow really of any sort. So how do you solve that issue with growing limbs?
Well, it's sort of built into the way we grow them. So you can take a pig heart and you can wash out all the pig cells and you're left with this sort of scaffold, this ghostly scaffold that's there. And then you're taking someone's own cells and using those to regrow all the heart tissue around that. And I mean, pig hearts and human hearts are about the same size. So you can take what was once a pig heart and is now more or less your heart and then put it into a human. And it would be the same thing with limbs. So we would grow all the right vascular systems and nervous systems automatically, and they would all be yours. So from a like robotics perspective, you might have issues with rejection and things like that. But when you're actually growing limbs and organs, the reason it's so awesome is because it's yours.
Yeah, like that's actually a strength of it, right? Because people have been doing transplants for, forever, where you get an organ or something from something that's not you, and there is a problem with rejection, like your body, your immune system will fight it. That's actually this is almost the solution to that problem, because all of our cells have the ability to grow another human. We actually do this, this is a little bit more simplified, but we do this actually crazy thing with plants where like you can essentially just clip off a piece of a plant, put it in a little petri dish, and if you put the right combination of chemicals and hormones on it, it just sprouts an entire new plant with roots, with a whole stalk and leaves and stuff. So cells have all the information they need to grow into anything. It's just a matter of understanding how to actually do that. So to do that, to regrow a limb or to regrow nerves for people who have nerve damage, stuff like that.
Right. How's it going? My name's John. Since I was like 8,
Hi, John.
I've always
John.
wanted an animal hybrid. And since I have access to some potential evil masterminds or potentially good ones, depending on your personal views, how would you create a cross-species hybrid with overcoming the biggest obstacle being the mother's immune system rejecting the embryo?
So before we answer that, because we will answer it, we'll tell you. I'll tell you. I don't know about that. There are international organizations. There are only a certain number of companies that actually make genes, right? So you'd have to order the genes eventually, right? And they talk to each other. And so they're like, this guy's ordered a lot of dog genes. Like a lot of dog genes. They'll probably stop selling you the genes, right? And it's really hard to make these genes on your own. So what we're going to tell you now, bear in mind, you probably couldn't do this. So to begin, I think, if you want to create a cross-human animal hybrid or anything else,
Any combination of animals.
you would have to have a really good understanding of what the human genome looks like what you actually need, right? Like those giant, pathways I put you up, you need all of that, right? You'll probably die if you don't have some of that. And we don't actually know what all of the genome does. That's the biggest problem. We know what a lot of it looks like, we don't know all of it does. So first you have to do that. Second, you have to know what all of the animal, the target genome is, right? Because you need to make sure if you want to be a dog, you need a dog heart, do you want a human heart, do you want to eat dog food, or do you want human food, right? Things like that. So I'll start with that. I'll let you guys take it from there. But there's a lot of information we would need to be able to do that, and we don't have now.
Anything else?
Mad scientist?
When you breed I think it's a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. I think that's the right combination there. And the issue is that can no longer breed, so I think you would run into those problems, and that would be your biggest issue. Even if you figured everything out to get your hybrid, it's gonna die at some point, and you can't really continue that on.
But at the same time, making much smaller modifications is probably entirely possible. We can already be pretty hairy, right? So, if you want to create a more fur-like, I have to ask, what are your motivations? No, I'm just But I'm just saying, if you wanted to make a furry human, you could probably do it with just a few modifications. So, you're not gonna go, directly into human-dog hybrid territory, but you're gonna be a much more dog-like human. And if one were to accrue those changes slowly, it probably would be possible if that's your thing.
And
you do you.
And just as kind of a follow-up, what about the science of ectogenesis?
I don't know what that is.
I've never heard that term.
Growing your hybrids in artificial wombs outside the mother.
Oh, I think that's totally plausible.
Oh, yeah.
What are the ethical implications of using the Cas9 CRISPR gene drive? Wouldn't we eventually remove natural selection from the equation, since eventually there will exist a population that will all have the gene drive?
I'm really happy. Just real quick, I want to point it out. I'm really happy you asked that, because scientists are having an enormous conference and talks about this all the time, and we've decided as scientists that we cannot exclude the public from these conversations.
Which is one of the reasons why we like doing this panel.
Right, because there are huge ethical implications, and I'll let Joe talk about those.
Yeah, so I mean, the main issue with malaria is you're reprogramming the entire mosquito population. And hopefully, once you do that, malaria can no longer live in those mosquitoes. But what about if you reprogram 99% of it, and then there's that 1% of mosquitoes that, even though it gets the gene drive, can still have malaria in it, and then we just used our greatest weapon against malaria, and it didn't work, and we have all these mosquitoes that we've already reprogrammed, and maybe they breed a lot faster, and they breed a lot better, and they carry malaria better once that 1% actually spreads back into the population. So we could, trying to do something really, really good, ruin that entire population and make the problem worse. And that's why there's scientists who are sitting on these projects that they know they can do, and they've been working on it for decades, and they themselves don't know if they want to implement it. It's a big problem for them personally, because they don't want to do anything that would damage our ecosystem or kill, instead of like 400,000 people, 1 million or 2 million people every year.
Yeah, there are some interesting workarounds, by the way, for the malaria mosquito issue. There's this really fascinating bacteria called Wolbachia, and the reason I'm telling you this is because it's actually being rolled out right now. So this bacteria, when it infects mosquitoes, makes it harder for them to transmit malaria. So it basically does exactly what you want the gene drive to do, but it's a bacteria instead. And people are actually, I think they did in Australia or someplace in the last year, they started infecting mosquitoes on a large scale with this bacteria because it naturally infects them anyway. It just wasn't infecting all of them. So I don't know, in terms of how that's going to go, I guess we'll learn very soon. But in that case, it's probably a lot less risky because it's something that naturally exists that we know, we've already been able to see how it goes. So it's always nicer when you can base whatever you're doing off of something that naturally exists.
There's also the whole ethical implication of actually do these organisms have a right to be alive, right? In previous CRISPR-Cas9 gene drive experiments, they were going to make these mosquitoes unable to reproduce, and we'd solve the malaria problem by destroying mosquitoes in total, right? And so we want the public's opinion on this issue, because it's not we can just decide, okay, mosquitoes get to die, but humans don't, and mice get to, but elephants don't. We need to determine what the value of existence for these species actually is. So I think that might be one of the bigger, less scientific, more ethical implications. We have about 5 minutes left, so we can take, I think, your question, and maybe one more, or a half a question after yours.
My question's actually, I guess, kind of related to that. In terms of viruses and bacteria and stuff, what scares you?
Ooh.
That's a great question.
We are overdue for a super bug, I would say. So that's what scares me, because everything is so interconnected, and we've been living these very fluid lives. So there's people that got on a plane today who are in Europe or China and are here today, and someone's getting on a plane and going there, and someone coughed on that person, and they're going to cough on someone else, and there's this huge mixing. And the fact that we haven't seen any disease that's just spread like wildfire, it feels like we're overdue for that.
Yeah, there was that flu in, the early 1900s that, just kills hundreds of millions of people. Essentially, nature is playing out a random, dice roll every single year with, is there going to be a virus that has the right combination of genes to totally screw us? And so, that's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, this research is so important, is to try to understand all of this stuff so that if nature does, roll a crit on us, that we can actually do something about it.
It puts the nature in nat 20.
Yeah. Puts the nature in nat 20. Oh my god. You're such a nerd. Why do I hang out with you?
You have
that is
to. Cool. All right.
Hello. Several things that you mentioned reminded me of Jurassic Park. And
of course.
I wondered, well, you mentioned Jurassic Park. That helped. I wondered if you had followed Jack Horner's research on inhibiting development of embryos to retain aspects of chickens to look like their prehistoric ancestors.
That's crazy.
Crazy. I don't know anything about it.
It's crazy. It's absolutely absurd, and that's why I love science. Because we can get up here and be oh yeah, here's the gene drives and things like that. I can get up here and tell you how to make Metroids, and there are actual people doing that, actually making dinosaurs. It's absurd. But the thing is, because of the way natural selection works, and as genes evolve over time, I think that to delay development for chickens into dinosaurs wouldn't work as well, just because I don't think that enough of the genes are left. Like it's not like you have a T-Rex and then you have a chicken. It's like you have like a third of a velociraptor, and then you have like a proto-chicken, and then you have a chicken.
But at the same time, there is kind of a really interesting, almost like history of all of the organisms that have ever lived in each of us. So, and in each animal. So even though you might have a fragmented history, there are perhaps little pieces of that could be useful for other things. Even if you can't straight up make a dinosaur, maybe you can learn one thing about a piece of a dinosaur and put the whole picture together like that.
Yeah, just don't use frogs to fill in the blanks. I think we saw in Hollywood why that doesn't work. All right, I think that's all the time we have. We're going to stick around for a little while after this. We'll be kind of pushed out of here, but we'll be outside. If you have any more additional questions, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Have a great PAX.